All right. Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. I need to slim down my bio, I think. And thanks also to the Institute of World Peace for having me tonight. It really is a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, Madam President, for your participation here as well. Thanks to the IWP team that made this possible, especially Ashton, who was the impetus for all of this. So today I'll be discussing Africa's central role in the Chinese Communist Party's global ambitions. We don't have long. I'm going to move fast. I will lead some stuff. I'll skip over some things, but I'm also going to try to leave room for Q&A. So hopefully if there's some burning question, we can get to it then. The United States has begun belatedly to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party views it as a competitor to be frustrated and defeated. The CCP's belief flows directly from its overarching, consistent strategic objective to return China to what it believes is the country's rightful place at the center of the world. In 1949, Mao Zedong described the objective as follows: "We will build up an entirely new, strong, and prosperous People's Democratic Republic of China, not only in name, but in facts." Most of us today are more familiar with Xi Jinping's preferred phrasing, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. We may be less familiar with Xi's 2017 speech to the National Party Congress when he said that China should, quote, "take center stage in the world," end quote. Other similar expressions of the CCP's belief that China should enjoy a dominant global role are easy to find. In the CCP's view, however, this great rejuvenation is currently blocked by a system created and maintained primarily by that fading, vindictive hegemon, the United States. Reordering this system is critical, and here is where the topic of our discussion today becomes relevant. What is greatly underappreciated, I believe, by American and other policymakers is the central role that Africa plays in the CCP's global ambitions, including those that directly challenge the United States. But let's start by going back to October 25th, 1971. A drama that has been running at the United Nations since 1950 is ending. An American-sponsored draft resolution of the type that it has been introducing annually for a decade is for the first time narrowly defeated in a vote at the UN General Assembly. The moment was reportedly electric, as everyone present recognized that the negative vote signaled that the next vote on perhaps the highest profile, most contentious, and decades-old issue at the United Nations was about to be resolved. When the next vote did indeed succeed, many delegates erupted in applause. Others sat in dismay. Resolution 2758 that had just been adopted switched China's UN seat from Taipei, Taiwan, to Beijing and expelled Taiwan from the UN and all its bodies, a situation that persists today. African countries provided 26 of the 76 yes votes for the resolution, leading Mao Zedong to later declare, "It was the black African brothers who carried us in." To this day, Chinese officials reference the crucial role African countries played in 1971. Yet, despite the obvious display of how helpful African states can be to the CCP, the party's interest in the continent has ebbed and flowed since 1949. As I'll get into a little bit later, we're very clearly in the flow state of this relationship, but this wasn't always the case. The CCP's first serious interest in the continent sprang from its view that Africa was fertile territory for spreading the global socialist revolution that Mao Zedong wanted China to lead. As early as 1949, Chinese President Liu Shaoqi, in a speech in Peking, declared that the Chinese Revolution was the correct one for developing countries, an insistence that eventually contributed to the Sino-Soviet split. By the 1960s, China was fully invested in African revolutions. Premier Zhou Enlai famously declared in a February 1964 speech in Mogadishu, quote, "Revolutionary prospects are excellent throughout Africa." He made similar remarks in Ghana and Tanzania. The next year, the Chinese defense minister expanded on the idea. Quote, the whole cause of world revolution hinges on the revolutionary struggles of the Asian, African, and Latin American people who make up the overwhelming majority of the world's population. The socialist countries should regard it as their international duty to support the people's revolutionary struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America." End quote. China had already split with the Soviet Union by this time and viewed Africa as a battleground on which to thwart Soviet and American influence. This led to the strange situation of, for instance, China intermittently supporting all three of Angola's primary rebel groups, depending on which ones were pro-Soviet at the time. In Mozambique, Chinese aid yo-yoed from Frelimo to Caremo to Frelimo again, depending on the state of Chinese-Soviet relations. The same pattern recurred in South Africa, when Beijing switched its initial support for the pro-Soviet African National Congress, which of course is the ruling party of South Africa today, to the rival Pan-Africanist Congress, and did not switch back to the ANC until its own relations with Moscow improved. China's zeal to lead the global socialist revolution led it to support not only liberation movements, but also armed groups fighting post-colonial, independent African governments in places like Burundi, Cameroon, the DRC, Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, and Uganda. African delegations began denouncing China from the floor of the United Nations. In 1962, Cameroon's representative noted, quote, "Against my own country, China has long pursued a policy of aggression." The CAR representative in 1968 described the Chinese embassy in his country as a factor of subversion. Later that year, the Nigerian representative declared, quote, "The support and encouragement which China reportedly gives to the rebel elements in my country have come as a rude shock to my government," end quote. This type of blowback, along with growing exasperation at the fecklessness of some of the armed movements and their lack of appropriate revolutionary ardor, led the CCP to dial back its support for the great African socialist revolution. Furthermore, Mao's death in 1976 finally ended the horrors of the CCP's Cultural Revolution that killed an estimated 1.5 million Chinese people. Over the preceding years, the CCP focused on rebuilding China's economy and society, and Africa faded in importance. However, one of the most infamous events in modern China's history was looming and would remind the CCP of how useful Africa could be to its ambitions. On June 4th, 1989, troops and tanks from the People's Liberation Army rolled into Tiananmen Square and killed thousands of student protesters. The Western world recoiled from the massacre. The US imposed economic sanctions on China, and China was isolated. A scant 3 months later, though, President Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso arrived in Beijing, becoming the first foreign leader to visit China following the massacre. According to the Beijing Review, at a welcome banquet for Compaoré, Chinese President Yang Changkun, quote, expressed thanks to African countries for their understanding of and support to China's quelling of the recent counter-revolutionary rebellion. That, of course, is a reference to the student uprising. It's easy to understand why some African leaders were happy to overlook the massacre. Compaoré himself seized power in a coup in 1987, during which his predecessor, the famous revolutionary Thomas Sankara, was murdered. In 1989, the 1990s wave of democratization in Africa had not yet manifested. In Africa, the CCP saw, among other things, many fellow non-democracies willing to overlook its human rights abuses and which could serve as a hedge against international diplomatic pressure. Since that time, the China-Africa relationship has massively accelerated. I won't belabor the statistics on trade, lending, and infrastructure provision, as I suspect that most of us are familiar with them. But I will give a few anecdotes about diplomatic matters to highlight the point. The 9th iteration of the Triennial Forum on China-Africa Cooperation just wrapped up in Beijing. As usual, it attracted nearly every African head of state. China has only ever had 2 alliances with the Soviet Union and North Korea, but it does have many partnerships. During FOCAC, it elevated to its basic partnership level every African country that didn't already have a partnership. The only exception was Eswatini, with which China doesn't have formal relations. In all, Beijing made or elevated partnerships with 30 African countries, and the China-Africa relationship was collectively dubbed, and stay with me here, the all-weather China-Africa community with a shared future for the new era. I don't know what the acronym there is, but it would be a doozy. While it's unclear what the exact significance of such partnerships is, my own observations suggest that they do indeed, in many cases, facilitate a wide range of economic, political, and cultural exchanges. One of the outcomes of FOCAC was the Chinese promise to invite 1,000 members of African political parties to visit China. This builds on a tradition of decades of diplomatic visits between Chinese government and CCP officials with African counterparts. For more than 30 years, with only 2 exceptions, the Chinese foreign minister has visited Africa as his first trip of every new year. In 12 years, Xi Jinping has visited Africa 4 times. Former President Hu Jintao visited 18 African countries in 10 years over the course of 4 trips. His predecessor visited 12 African countries during 4 trips as president. This does not capture the scores of trips that premiers have made or the many hundreds of trips lower level but still senior officials have undertaken. Chinese foreign ministers alone have visited all 53 African states with which China has relations. I don't know how many African countries American secretaries of state have visited since 1949, but I suspect it is far fewer than that. And regarding presidents, people like myself who study Africa are thrilled if we get 1 or 2 presidential trips to the continent during 2 terms in office. The visits from Africa to China are even more frequent. As just a few examples, under former South African President Jacob Zuma, every member of the ruling party's National Executive Committee traveled to China for political party trainings. President of Equatorial Guinea, Teodoro Obiang, just finished his 12th visit to China. Former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe visited China 14 times. The Republic of Congo's Denis Nguesso just finished his 17th trip to China. And former Namibian President Sam Nujoma might be the leader here, having visited 18 times. All those leaders ruled for decades, yes. But the pace of visits is still remarkable. In the case of Nguesso, for instance, it worked out to him visiting China just under every 2.5 years. This camaraderie has contributed to real Chinese diplomatic gains that have real consequences for the United States. Virtually any account of a meeting between Chinese and African officials will include the African side expressing its support for the One China policy. Some African countries have now adopted Beijing's updated preferred nomenclature of supporting the national reunification of Taiwan and China. The methods for this reunification are left unspecified. African states have also been decisive in protecting China from international condemnation for its human rights abuses. Between 2019 and 2022, 9 letters supportive of China's Xinjiang policies circulated at the United Nations. On average, African countries have comprised 47% of the signatories of those letters. From 2019 to 2023, 9 condemnatory letters have also circulated. On average, African countries have comprised 2% of the signatories of those letters. Only 3 African countries, Eswatini, Liberia, and Somalia, have ever signed a condemnatory letter, and Somalia only did it once. 5 of the letters went unsigned by any African country. Beginning in 1990, the UN Commission on Human Rights and its successor, the Human Rights Council, considered 13 draft resolutions condemning or scrutinizing China's human rights record. Each one failed. On average, of the African countries voting, 73% voted against the resolutions, 5% voted for, and 22% abstained. In total, Africa provided 39% of the votes that defeated the draft resolutions, 3% of the supportive votes, and 22% of the abstentions. This is all despite the UN's own 2022 report finding that, quote, serious human rights violations have been committed in Xinjiang. jumping ahead, that may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. The most recent of these proposed draft resolutions was in 2022, but that was the first one in 18 years, a demonstration of how fruitless concerned countries believe it to be to raise the problem at the Human Rights Council. African states have provided similar support to defeat resolutions that would return Taiwan to the United Nations and its agencies, including the World Health Assembly, which became a minor controversy during the COVID-19 pandemic. African countries also voiced support for China's preferred method for resolving the disputes that its aggressive expansion in the South China Sea has sparked, for China's accession to the World Trade Organization, for the 2020 national security law that stripped Hong Kong of key freedoms, and for other core Chinese priorities. Furthermore, Chinese officials have praised African support for the election of Chinese nationals to head UN bodies. In 2020, Chinese nationals headed 4 of the UN's 15 specialized agencies. Those were the ITU, the ICAO, the FAO, and UNIDO. All 4 are key to setting global regulatory standards for, in the case of the ITU, for instance, the telecommunications industry. If we disbelieve that Chinese nationals in such posts are obligated to use them to privilege Chinese standards and foreign policy goals, consider this 2020 quote from Wu Hongbo, former Undersecretary General for the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Quote, "As a Chinese international civil servant, when it comes to Chinese national sovereignty and security, we will undoubtedly defend our country's interests." UNIDO now officially endorses the Belt and Road Initiative, a pillar of China's efforts to reorient the global economy towards itself. And during the COVID pandemic, the ICAO, that is responsible for air navigation and safety standards, excluded Taiwan from the relevant dialogue. Given all this, it is no wonder that in 2006, the Chinese government media referred to African states' political support for China as indispensable. Chinese Foreign Minister and now also Director of the CCP's Central Committee Foreign Affairs Commission Office, Wang Yi, proclaimed in 2015 that China-Africa relations are, quote, "the most fundamental basis of Chinese diplomacy." At this point, it's important to include several caveats. The CCP is interested in Africa for many reasons, not only for its diplomatic support. The continent's massive and growing youth population is an attractive market. Africa is also strategically located and perches on a variety of global shipping choke points and sea lines of communication, a great concern of Chinese strategists given the country's dependence on maritime trade. Beijing must also protect its large diaspora on the continent. And finally, having a strong overseas presence is the type of things that great powers do. I also don't want to give the impression that African support for Chinese foreign policy goals is solely a reaction to Chinese overtures. In many instances, the CCP is appealing to existing African uneasiness about the current world order. Africa is not a monolith, and different countries and people have different perspectives on these issues, but on average, African governments have a reflective skepticism of the West because of, 1, the history of Western colonization, 2, the sense that wealthy powers treat Africa unfairly, and 3, I would argue, some cynical African politicians who excuse their own poor governance by blame casting. Within this general skepticism of the West in the US are currently some specific grievances. First, the fact that when US interest rates go up, so does much of African debt that is dollar denominated. This is a real problem for the continent. Second, the fact that Africa is unrepresented among the permanent UN Security Council members. Third, many African states dislike sanctions and frequently support a recurring UN resolution decrying unilateral coercive measures. And fourth, there's frustration that the United States and Europe are discouraging development of African oil and gas when the continent faces a massive under-electrification problem that has profound economic and social consequences. Now I'll turn to a topic that is much on the minds of American and other policymakers: critical minerals and the role that Africa plays for China in this important industry. While much of the discussion around critical minerals is relatively recent, China sought Ugandan cobalt for its atomic weapons tests as far back as the 1960s. Minerals from Africa have always been on the CCP's radar. However, more usually, China has been interested primarily in oil, among Africa's many natural resource endowments. In 2004, African oil comprised nearly 1/3 of Chinese oil imports, which was double what it imported from Saudi Arabia at that time. In 2023, however, that number had plummeted to only 10%, and that was despite the Chinese economy booming for much of that time. But while African oil has steadily decreased in importance for China, there's been an opposite trend regarding certain minerals. In 2000, Dilokong Chrome Mine in South Africa was the only operating mine under Chinese control in all of Africa. 10 years later, Chinese companies controlled producing mines in Ghana, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. By 2018, Chinese companies controlled around 6% of the total value of African mine production. Today, that number is at the high end, about 8% of the value of African mining output. Now, 8% isn't a particularly impressive number, especially when compared to the share of firms from countries like Canada, the UK, and Australia, which are mining superpowers. But what is relevant to our discussion today is China's outsized role controlling certain minerals and the mining operations in certain key countries. Chinese firms are responsible for about 25% of the DRC's minerals and metals production by value, and control 15 of the 19 cobalt operations there. And of all the countries in the world, the DRC may well be the most blessed with natural resources, or cursed, depending on your perspective. In Zambia, Chinese firms control 12% of production by value. In Guinea, that number is over 1/3. Chinese companies control all 4 of Eritrea's operational mines. In the last several years, Chinese firms have invested $4.5 billion in lithium mines, many in Latin America and Africa. China is also by far the primary importer of African minerals. In 2020, it bought 43% of sub-Saharan Africa's mineral exports. And while this next point isn't specific to Africa, it's relevant to the broader debate about critical minerals. China dominates the production and refining of key minerals. For example, in 2020, China controlled more than 50% of rare earths mining capacity and 85% of the refining. In 2022, China refined 68% of the world's nickel, 40% of its copper, 59% of its lithium, and 73% of its cobalt. Today, it processes nearly 100% of the world's graphite production and produces more than 90% of its manganese products. This stranglehold on the refining and processing of some of the minerals most important to the global economy, the high-tech and green industries of today and tomorrow, and the national defense of many countries should surprise no one, as it is consonant with Beijing's very public Made in China 2025 strategic plan. Finally, I want to briefly call our attention to a different type of resource, but one that is at least as valuable as critical minerals to the CCP's efforts to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and that is data of varying types. In January last year, the China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation finished the first phase of a controversial building project contracted by the African Union and paid for by the Chinese government. The South African paper Daily Maverick reported that the normal AU approval process for the project had been circumvented to the point that the AU signed the agreement without officially informing member states. One anonymous diplomat stated, "As member states, we have no information on the project." The project was the construction of the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention headquarters. The headquarters will do many things, including hosting an Institute of Pathogen Genomics that is building, quote, integrated cross-continent laboratory networks. It will be a hub, in other words, that is likely to handle genomic data from across Africa, making it a fabulously valuable organization to have access to. Let me explain why. African genomic data may well be among the richest prizes on Earth. According to a 2020 Financial Times article, quote, African genomes are not only humanity's oldest, but our most diverse, and that diversity holds within it an almost unfathomable potential, from scientific breakthroughs to gene editing to the rewriting of our evolutionary history, end quote. The African genome is also massively underexplored, meaning that there are almost certainly discoveries waiting there that could accelerate the development of valuable drugs, unveil disease cures, enhance artificial intelligence underpinning precision medicine, or be used to develop biological weapons. It so happens that Beijing is fully aware of the value of diverse and extensive genomic data. As a 2021 National Counterintelligence and Security Center report noted, the PRC, China, views bulk personal data, including healthcare and genomic data, as a strategic commodity to be collected and used for its economic and national security priorities. That report points to the fact that there are uses beyond pharmaceutical developments for genomic data, especially genomic data of the kind from Africa that harbors extraordinary diversity. China has set 2030 as the mark for when it wishes to be the world leader in artificial intelligence. Beijing believes that doing so will change the People's Liberation Army into a, quote, world-class military and vault the Chinese economy past America's, thereby hastening the toppling of the US from its current dominant perch. Now, artificial intelligence learns by consuming as much and as diverse data as possible. If China can access vast amounts of African genomic data, it will speed, perhaps decisively, the development of its AI capabilities. These capabilities are also central to the CCP's vast system of domestic control. China is now the world leader in AI-powered facial recognition technology that it uses to track especially ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs and Tibetans. Better Chinese AI will mean even more capable Chinese surveillance of all of its citizens. Already active in Africa are Chinese big data and AI companies that are also involved in surveillance in places like Xinjiang. Those companies include CloudWalk, Hikvision, Huawei, and BGI. Two of the latter's subsidiaries, so subsidiaries of BGI, are under US Department of Commerce sanctions for, quote, conducting genetic analyses used to further the repression of Muslim minority groups in the Xinjiang region, end quote. For its part, CloudWalk was in the news in 2018 after the Zimbabwean government contracted it to build a facial database of all Zimbabweans. A CloudWalk representative was quoted in the Global Times, a Chinese government mouthpiece, quote, the company is also developing an AI system which can recognize different people from their gait, shape, or haircut and could be added to facial recognition, end quote. When you combine that with other realities of Chinese activity on the continent, including Chinese-built telecommunications networks, where Huawei and ZTE are entirely dominant, undersea cables, where Huawei Maritime, a former subsidiary of Huawei, has been involved in 11 of such cables, government data centers, sensitive buildings such as presidents' residences, ministries of foreign affairs, and parliaments built by Chinese companies and in many cases subsidized by the Chinese government. It likely means that China is already benefiting from African data and is in search for more as it seeks to win the race for artificial intelligence supremacy. Now, lest I be accused of being overly suspicious of China's friendliness and goodwill, I offer the following observations. The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is an existential issue for the CCP. Those are the stakes. It must succeed, and Chinese strategic documents make clear that data is central to succeeding. In 2013, Xi Jinping declared, quote, the vast ocean of data, just like oil resources during industrialization, contains immense productive power and opportunities. Whoever controls big data technologies will control the resources for development and have the upper hand. He explicitly sees this as a competition and has for a long time. Accordingly, China's 13th five-year plan identified big data as a, quote, fundamental strategic resource. In 2020, the CCP codified data into its doctrine as the fifth factor of production. Here is Xi again in 2021, as quoted in a Hoover Institution report. Quote, we should stand at the commanding height of overall strategy of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the great changes in the world unseen in a century, and coordinate two major issues, namely domestic and international development, and the security of development. We should fully utilize the advantages of having massive data and a wealth of application scenarios, promote deep integration of digital technology in the real economy, empower the transformation and upgrading of traditional industries, generate new industries, new business forms, and new models, and continuously strengthen and expand China's digital economy, end quote. We've already seen the lengths to which the Chinese government will go to capture data, as the US and its companies have been among the primary victims of Chinese hacking campaigns. These include the 2013 Office of Personnel Management hack that exposed the records of 22 million Americans, the 2014 Marriott Hotel hack that captured the records of 500 million people, and the 2017 Equifax hack of 145 million people's records. And that is just a very partial list. A 2021 NPR story noted that, quote, intelligence officials estimate that China has now stolen all the personal identifiable information of about 80% of Americans, and it has a good start on collecting information on the remaining 20%. We know as well that equipment from prominent Chinese companies such as Huawei is often riddled with backdoors and other security vulnerabilities. A cybersecurity firm in 2019 found that more than half the Huawei devices it tested had at least one possible backdoor that could allow unauthorized access, a far higher rate of vulnerability than devices from other companies. A British oversight board found, quote, nationally significant software security failures in Huawei equipment in 2019. Papua New Guinea's national data center, completed by Huawei in 2018, is marred by a variety of cybersecurity issues that expose secret government data to spying and exploitation. In 2020, then National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien noted, quote, we have evidence that Huawei has the capability secretly to access sensitive and personal information in systems it maintains and sells around the world. There are many similar issues with other major Chinese tech companies, including those active here in the US and in Africa. Finally, China's National Intelligence Law of 2017 requires all organizations and citizens to support national intelligence work. If the CCP comes knocking at a Chinese company's door, that company is legally obliged to turn over whatever data it has. So, what should the US government do given this reality? There are many recommendations to be made, but I'll offer just 4 quick ones. Semi-quick. First, focus US-Africa policy on motivating and helping the US private sector and that of close partner countries get more involved on the continent. The US has traditionally focused its Africa policy on development assistance and security cooperation. However, the US's position on the continent has continued to deteriorate, and there's little prospect that Washington can do significantly more security cooperation or humanitarian development. Yet there are many unclaimed opportunities in Africa for US businesses. More US-Africa commercial engagement will strengthen US influence on the continent, strengthen the American economy, and help ameliorate the great existential crisis of virtually every African country, which is jobs for a large and growing youth population. Having commercial engagement as the basis for partnership will lead to a much more equal and stronger relationship with African countries as well. Second, be more circumspect and discerning about pressuring African countries on issues of human rights and democracy. Concern for and promotion of those ideals should remain baked into US agencies and activities in Africa, as the spread of democracy is a strategic American interest. However, the tactics should change, as public beratings do not effectively promote democracy or human rights. It is often even counterproductive, with the added disadvantage of usually antagonizing countries that could otherwise help the US achieve its national interests. Third, institutionalized cooperation with close partners such as Japan, Korea, Israel, and some of the Gulf states. The challenges and opportunities in Africa are far too large for the US to manage alone. And it should find ways to make cooperation with partners that can complement US efforts regular, predictable, and easy. Fourth, develop a strategic messaging campaign. China has one, and its officials execute it so faithfully that their statements about Africa are deadly dull in their consistency. The US should focus its messaging on the demonstrable, proven advantages that a capitalist democratic system has. It must be honest about its shortcomings, of which there are plenty, but it shouldn't inflate them either, or lose the moral perspicacity to distinguish between its activities and those of truly abusive countries. It shouldn't hesitate to point out the falsities within Chinese official messaging as well, such as pointing out the inconstancy and self-interest that was a feature of its support for armed movements in Africa, but which China nevertheless touts on the continent today. Fifth and finally, don't count on accountability at the United Nations. In a body that represents most countries at a time when most countries are not free and open democracies, it is unsurprising that the UN increasingly reflects the preferences of undemocratic and abusive states. In fact, it is fast becoming a significant tool of authoritarian regimes such as China's. A September 2023 white paper from the Chinese government entitled Reform and Development of Global Governance references the UN 37 times, positively references, I should add. The recent FOCAC communique said, quote, China and Africa jointly call for an equal and orderly multipolar world and firmly safeguard the international system with the UN at its core, the international order underpinned by international law and the basic norms governing international relations underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. That all sounds benign and even admirable. But consider what is happening. The UN Human Rights Council has institutionalized Xi Jinping thought and the CCP's conception of human rights in the 2017 resolution entitled Contribution of Development to Enjoyment of All Human Rights. There are at least two implications of this. Elevating development to the level of traditional natural human rights is designed to dilute the latter. After all, if everything is a right, then nothing is. And authoritarian governments and movements like the CCP are using the concept of development as a human right to excuse its own abuse of traditional natural human rights, such as the right to free speech, the free exercise of religion, freedom of movement and gathering, and others. To sum up all of this, Africa is central to the Chinese Communist Party's most cherished global ambitions, and the United States and other like-minded countries ignore that reality at their peril. Many thanks for your kind attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
I'd like to ask, it seems to me like China benefits from this more than anybody else. What key things do the African countries get from all of these agreements and friendships and alliances?
African states do receive, a number of benefits, real ones as well. So the provision of infrastructure is a significant one that is frequently referenced, and that is real. Now, some of those projects are white elephant projects, where the economic return is very unclear at best, to put it kindly. But some are really valuable: roads, dams, bridges, things of that nature. So that's probably the first thing you would hear from our African friends. African rulers receive any number of benefits. And Chinese engagement focuses on cultivating political entities at the highest possible level, and then having those relationships facilitate other actions at a lower echelon. So it's been very well documented that some African leaders have accepted bribes, for instance, from either Chinese companies or the Chinese government. And let me be clear, we're talking about Africa. That's the focus of the conversation, but this is a global phenomenon. But they also receive a certain amount of political legitimacy because Chinese companies can indeed put up a stadium quickly or a road, or they can move quickly. And there was a commentator who was writing a book on this who sort of wryly commented on the fact that it was extraordinary how frequently the completion date of Chinese infrastructure projects on the continent coincided with African elections. And the idea here is an African ruler, if he's 2 years out, let's say, from an election, can ask China to build a road or something that he can then use in his campaign. So I don't want to give the impression that there's zero benefits and it's all downside for African states. They do get real benefits. Those are just a few that I referenced. Trade, although the trade, the imbalanced trade is becoming an issue between Africa and China. There's consternation growing in Africa that their exports pale in comparison to the Chinese imports. You've also had Chinese imports wipe out local economies or local trades, especially textiles and things of that nature. But by and large, trade is a good thing, and African states appreciate that. China is not actually the biggest investor in Africa, but it is a significant one. It is the largest bilateral lender as well. So African states have received many loans from China over the years. Now, again, this is becoming yet another issue in the relationship. You now have debt defaults blossoming across the continent, and that's becoming a point of contention with the Chinese. So it's a broad range of potential benefits and real benefits.
There's been some talk recently about headwinds coming for the Chinese economy, its possible effect on Chinese society that might bring about as well. Do you see that as a real problem for China, and how might that affect China's position in Africa?
I think it is a real problem. I think the Chinese government is already managing it so we've seen a very real pivot away from the high profile, very expensive infrastructure projects with a long time horizon to what the Chinese government now refers to as small and beautiful, or small or beautiful, depending on which translation you're looking at. Projects that have a much shorter time horizon, are more bankable, and they're also trying to do many more sort of alternative financing models. So public-private partnerships is a big element now of what they're doing. So again, the years, and it was years, of massive Chinese lending from China Exim, for instance, are probably well and truly behind us, except for a few key projects. And interestingly, out of FOCAC, we saw some pretty large commitments on infrastructure, including like 15 roads in Kenya, which was really significant. There's also a huge potential iron ore mining operation in Guinea, in the Simandou Mountains that China's interested in because it would help break their dependence on Australian ore, with which they have a very tense relation. So I think this pivot is indeed because of the economic headwinds you just referenced, which are harder to combined with these debt defaults. It's happening at the same time. It's much harder to deal with the debt defaults when you have economic troubles at home than if the Chinese economy was roaring as usual. There's also rumors that the Chinese population has angst around the idea of the Chinese government making grants and granting other largesse to Africa when there's still poverty in China, when there is a real economic problem in China. It's really hard to nail that down because how do you get a true sense of the Chinese population's views on these? But someone will see a few Weibo posts and say, "Oh, this, Chinese people believe this," and maybe, but it's a few Weibo posts. So, I think this is a real issue. It's something the Chinese government is going to have to figure out and continue to figure out. Their truly big challenge are the debt defaults that are happening right now, and African countries expect restructuring. They expect forgiveness. We went through this with the HIPC process that began in the 90s. And the Paris Club, which is the group of primary creditors to Africa, rich countries, they forgave a bunch of debt. China does not want to do that. It doesn't want to set a precedent because it holds debt all over the continent. And it is hard to make that case politically back home. Now, it can ignore its citizens pretty easily, but still, they worry about these things. So it's a problem. They're working through how to manage it. I think they've had some success so far, but it'll be very interesting to watch moving forward.
I believe China has been able to look at the interests of most African countries when it comes to their national security interests. I think in meeting with Major General this afternoon, he mentioned the fact that there are certain things that most African countries are looking out for to better their lives. And those are some of the things that the Chinese government have realized and has used it as a bait to grow in certain projects for Africans that will attract them. Okay? And based on that, they are making inroads within African soil, bringing a lot of people in there to corrupt the system. Now, in Ghana, for instance, we have Chinese coming into the mining sector, doing illegal mining, destroying water bodies, extracting minerals outside. And Ghana is not benefiting, but rather it is causing mayhem to food security, environmental security. And we stand to lose a lot of things that our natural resources are also being affected. So they've been able to identify certain things, and they are basing on it to destroy the environment. Now, there is an issue about one Chinese woman who is called Aisha Wan. And she was named, that was a popular name, Aisha Wan, the Galamsey Queen. That's illegal mining queen. She was caught, deported. After 3 months, she came back to the country. Caught again, and now, based on the pressure that people were giving, I think she was given some sentence. As to whether she still sits in the prison, we don't know. So these are some of the influences that they are using. Robbing the palms of African leaders, corrupting them here and there, so that they can grow in and then come and do their own thing. So these are some of the policies that they are using. And it is not helping Africa. Even though they are trying to address certain things, but they are used as a bait to draw African leaders, corrupt them, and then in turn destroy their water environment, environmental, and all. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Ghana has been much in the news for the reasons you just referenced, the illegal Chinese mining and the struggle that the Ghanaian government has had in cracking down on that. That's a continent-wide phenomenon, not in every country, but mineral-rich countries have struggled with this frequently. Maybe the single greatest example of a corrupt deal around natural resources was the Sycamines deal out of DRC, which more and more information comes out about it, but it may have been one of the most corrupt deals in history. I don't want to overstate it, but the extent of it was extraordinary, where Chinese companies got access to copper and cobalt mines in exchange for infrastructure that they were supposed to build. It came out several years ago. They had built virtually nothing. They had taken out probably tens of billions of dollars worth of minerals. And it was, there's some sort of deal struck with the current government in DRC, the Tshisekedi government. And those mining companies continue on. On the corruption issue, I think it's always useful to remember that China is still itself a very corrupt country. And so Chinese companies are frequently, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but I think it is fair to say that they frequently are corrupt themselves. So they will look for any sort of angle or advantage, sharp business practice as possible, because that's the environment that they operate in China. And when you don't have a host government that is either willing or capable to deter or punish that type of behavior, then you have real problems. One of the really interesting reports I ever read was that Chinese infrastructure is actually pretty high quality in African countries that have a strong oversight and regulatory regime. It is poor in countries that do not have a good oversight or regulatory regime. So again, they'll sort of get away with what they can get away with. And ultimately, it's incumbent upon the host country government to ensure this sort of thing is not happening. But it is hard because they're very adept at the corruption game and others. So, yeah. Oh, all right.
I want to quickly thank Joshua Meservey for joining us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but you're more than welcome to hang out in the lobby and discuss amongst yourselves anything that we didn't get to. But just want to thank him once again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.